In a small, racially divided town, a wealthy black judge, Jonathan Hayes, discovers a young black boy, Malcolm Rivers, has been unjustly accused of theft. As Jonathan investigates, he unearths a web of systemic racism and corruption, orchestrated by a racist deputy and a desperate store owner seeking to protect their power. Faced with prejudice, abuse of authority, and a community complicit in silence, Jonathan must confront the infuriating injustices of a broken system that targets the innocent and shields the guilty. The story exposes the harsh realities of racism in America and the fight for justice. The rain came down in steady sheets, painting the city in a dull gray that matched Aaron Matthews's mood. Seated by the window of a bustling corner cafe, he absently stirred his coffee, his phone flashing with emails he wasn't reading. Another deal had collapsed that morning, one he had spent months building, and now everything felt heavier than it should. Outside, umbrellas bobbed through the wet streets like colorful buoys on a stormy sea. Aaron should have been anywhere but here. Back at the office, salvaging the remnants of his work, pacing his sleek penthouse while strategizing his next move. Instead, he sat rooted to the spot, feeling drained, staring blankly as raindrops raced each other down the glass. Then he noticed her, an elderly woman, small and frail, stood across the street. Her coat, too thin for the weather, clung to her shoulders as she struggled to maneuver a paper-wrapped bouquet of flowers into her bag. The flowers had wilted in the downpour, their petals falling like soft tears to the ground. People passed her without a glance, too absorbed in their own lives to notice. But Aaron couldn't look away. There was something about her, a quiet dignity in the way she fumbled with her belongings, a determination that defied the odds stacked against her. Without thinking, Aaron grabbed his coat and dashed outside into the rain. "Ma'am," he called, reaching her just as a gust of wind snatched the bouquet from her hands. Flowers tumbled onto the slick pavement. The woman turned to him, startled. Her eyes, though clouded with age, were striking, a familiar deep blue that pulled at something inside him, a memory long buried. "I'm sorry," Aaron said, bending to retrieve the scattered stems. "Here, let me help you." Her face softened as she watched him kneel, the rain soaking through his coat. "Oh, you don't have to do that," she said, her voice kind but faint. "They're already ruined." Aaron stood, holding out the bedraggled bouquet. "Maybe," he replied, offering her a small smile. "But sometimes things can still be beautiful, even when they're a little broken." The woman's expression flickered. Surprise, gratitude, something else Aaron couldn't quite place. She took the flowers with trembling hands. "Thank you. You're very kind." "It's no trouble," Aaron said, brushing wet hair from his forehead. "Can I walk you somewhere? Do you need help?" The woman hesitated before nodding slowly. "I'm just heading to the cemetery," she said softly. "To see my son." Her words sent a chill through Aaron, though he couldn't explain why. A cemetery, a son. The rain suddenly felt colder, sharper. As they started walking, Aaron stole another glance at her. There was a strange familiarity about her face, a nagging feeling that he had seen her before. He pushed the thought away, chalking it up to déjà vu. But as the rain continued to fall, soaking them both in silence, Aaron couldn't shake the feeling that this encounter was no accident, that their paths had crossed for a reason he had yet to understand. The smell of fresh coffee and sizzling bacon hung in the air like a comfort blanket, mingling with the quiet chatter of a handful of customers scattered around the small-town diner. It wasn't anything fancy. A few booths with cracked vinyl seats lined the walls, while a faded chalkboard menu hung behind the counter, listing breakfast specials written in uneven handwriting. The waitress on duty, a middle-aged woman with tired eyes and a warm smile, moved briskly between tables, coffee pot in hand. Outside, the early morning sun glowed faintly over the rooftops, the start of a slow and ordinary day for most of the town's residents. But for Jonathan Hayes, sitting quietly at the corner booth, every day was far from ordinary. Dressed in a pressed but unassuming navy blue suit, he didn't look much different from any other middle-aged professional trying to catch a moment of peace before the day unraveled. His neatly trimmed beard added to his air of quiet composure, and though his clothes hinted at success, there was nothing about Jonathan that screamed wealthy or powerful. And yet, Jonathan Hayes was one of the most influential names in the country. Chief Justice of the State Supreme Court. It was a title that carried weight, power, and responsibility. His rulings shaped laws, his decisions rippled through communities. Lawyers, politicians, and reporters hung on his every word. But here, in a modest diner on the outskirts of a forgotten town, none of that mattered. And that was exactly why Jonathan liked coming here. He sipped his black coffee, bitter and strong, while his other hand thumbed through the morning newspaper. No phones, no assistants, no calls interrupting his thoughts. It was a rare pocket of anonymity that he allowed himself, far away from the polished marble floors and grand courthouses where people stood when he entered the room. "Refill, hun?" Jonathan looked up to see Marge, the waitress, hovering beside him with a pot of steaming coffee. Her smile was as practiced as it was genuine. Equal parts, weary and kind. She'd been working the diner long enough to know most of the customers by name. Jonathan, she didn't know, but he liked it that way. "Please," he said, offering her a small nod. "You're new around here, aren't you?" Marge asked, pouring the coffee into his mug. "I don't think I've seen you before." Jonathan gave her a faint smile, carefully folding his newspaper. "I pass through from time to time," he said, his voice calm and measured. "You on business?" "Something like that." Marge nodded, apparently satisfied with his vague response. "Well, enjoy your breakfast, sugar holler, if you need anything." Jonathan watched her retreat behind the counter, her apron swishing as she greeted a group of truck drivers who had just walked in. Outside the window, cars passed lazily on the main road, a sharp contrast to the fast-paced cities Jonathan was used to navigating. He glanced at his watch. He had an hour to kill before his meeting at the courthouse across town. This wasn't a typical case, and it wasn't his courtroom. But it was important enough for him to make the trip. He was here for a preliminary hearing in a case that had drawn quiet but unmistakable tension across the community. The details were as familiar as they were unsettling. A black teenage boy accused of theft from a wealthy shop owner. It wasn't Jonathan's job to intervene, and he wasn't here in any official capacity. But his presence was intentional, a subtle reminder that justice should not, and could not, be dictated by prejudice or power. Jonathan knew how these stories often played out. He had seen them unfold too many times, even in his own life. He set his coffee down and glanced toward the door as it chimed open, signaling the arrival of a new customer. A young white man, no older than 25, sauntered in, dressed in a worn leather jacket and faded jeans. He didn't look out of place, another small-town regular. But there was something in the way he walked, shoulders squared, chin tilted slightly upward, that drew Jonathan's attention. The young man's gaze swept across the diner, briefly locking onto Jonathan, before flicking away dismissively, as though he hadn't seen anything worth noticing. Jonathan was used to that people often underestimated him, and he let them. Let them see what they wanted to see, he thought. He turned back to his newspaper, but his attention lingered on the young man, who slid into a booth near the front. Jonathan had learned to recognize subtle tensions in a room, a glance too sharp, a voice pitched too loud, and something about this man didn't sit right. Minutes later, as Marge approached the young man with a notepad, Jonathan's unease solidified. "What'll it be today, Dylan?" Marge asked cheerfully. Dylan. So he was a regular. Jonathan tuned out their conversation, returning his focus to the case file sitting in his leather briefcase. The evidence was flimsy at best, conflicting witness statements, security footage that conveniently cut out at the critical moment. Yet the town had already made up its mind, and Jonathan knew what that meant for the young boy on trial. He took another sip of coffee, his thoughts clouding with frustration. No matter how far he'd risen, Jonathan was still haunted by the systemic hurdles he'd fought to overcome. Hurdles that young black men continued to face every day. When he looked up again, Dylan was standing at the counter, chatting with Marge as she refilled his coffee. Jonathan couldn't hear what he was saying, but his tone was flippant, and every few seconds, his gaze darted toward Jonathan's table. Jonathan folded his hands and waited. He wasn't the type to stir trouble, but trouble had a habit of finding him, no matter how unassuming he tried to appear. Eventually, Dylan turned fully toward Jonathan's booth, his voice cutting through the quiet hum of the diner. "Hey there, buddy," Dylan called out, his words dripping with mock friendliness. "You look a little lost. This your first time in a real diner?" The room stilled. Marge's face froze mid-smile as she glanced nervously between Jonathan and Dylan. A few customers lowered their forks, the quiet scrape of silverware against plates coming to an awkward halt. Jonathan didn't move. He didn't need to. He had dealt with men like Dylan all his life. Men who wore their insecurities like armor, who mistook silence for weakness. "I'm exactly where I need to be," Jonathan replied evenly, his voice calm but firm. Dylan smirked, clearly unbothered. "That right?" he drawled, stepping closer to Jonathan's booth. "Just doesn't seem like your kind of place, that's all." Jonathan's dark eyes met his, steady and unwavering. He didn't take the bait. "I'm here for the same reason as everyone else," he said quietly. "A good cup of coffee." Dylan's smirk faltered, replaced by something sharper, meaner. "Right," he muttered, turning back toward the counter. "Enjoy your coffee, sir." The emphasis on the last word wasn't lost on anyone. Jonathan exhaled slowly, letting the tension dissipate as the diner's hum of conversation returned. He could feel Marge's eyes on him, her expression a mix of apology and embarrassment. "Ignore him," she said softly as she passed his table, her voice tinged with regret. "He's all talk." Jonathan nodded, offering her a reassuring smile. "I'm used to it." And he was. But as he sat back in his booth, fingers tapping lightly against his coffee cup, Jonathan couldn't ignore the nagging feeling that this wasn't over. That Dylan's words were just the beginning of something brewing under the surface. Something that wouldn't be ignored for long. The courthouse parking lot was nearly empty when Jonathan Hayes arrived. The old brick building sat in the center of the small town like a forgotten relic, its steps cracked and its paint peeling. The air smelled of damp earth and car exhaust, and the distant hum of traffic from the main road drifted faintly in the background. Jonathan stepped out of his car, briefcase in hand. The modest navy suit he wore looked out of place here, too sharp, too refined for a town that seemed perpetually stuck in another decade. He adjusted his cufflinks, an unconscious habit, as his eyes scanned the building. A thin man in a sheriff's uniform leaned lazily against the double doors, a disposable coffee cup in one hand. His name tag read, S. Klein. Jonathan's steps echoed as he approached the entrance, the sound loud in the morning stillness. "Morning," Jonathan greeted calmly, offering a polite nod. The deputy squinted at him, his expression unreadable but not friendly. "Can I help you?" Jonathan raised an eyebrow but remained composed. "I'm here for the preliminary hearing," he replied evenly, pausing just a step away. "Judge Winters should already be inside." Deputy Klein gave him a slow, deliberate once-over, his gaze lingering a little too long on Jonathan's face, then drifting to his suit and briefcase. "You with the defense?" he asked, voice sharp with assumption. Jonathan's smile was faint, his tone unfazed. "I'm here to observe." "Observe, huh?" Klein muttered, as though the word itself tasted wrong in his mouth. He took a loud sip of coffee, still blocking the door. "And you are?" Jonathan paused, feeling the familiar ripple of frustration in his chest. He'd been here before, many times, in places just like this one. Men like Klein always looked at him the same way, their eyes carrying unspoken accusations, assumptions tied to the color of his skin rather than the content of his character. "Jonathan Hayes," he said simply, meeting the deputy's gaze without flinching. Something shifted in Klein's expression. Surprise, perhaps, though it was quickly masked. He straightened slightly, his tone suddenly colder. "You with the media?" "No." "Then you might want to find yourself a seat in the back," Klein said, jerking his head toward the doors, a dismissive note in his voice. "Don't want to get in the way." Jonathan held his ground for a moment longer, silent. He didn't rise to the bait, though the sting of the insult settled somewhere in his gut. Instead, he gave the deputy a curt nod and walked past him, pushing open the heavy doors without another word. Inside, the courthouse lobby was dimly lit and smelled faintly of cleaning chemicals. Jonathan's polished shoes clicked on the scuffed floors as he made his way toward the small courtroom where the hearing was taking place. He passed two clerks who paused their quiet conversation to stare at him, their eyes wide with a mixture of curiosity and something else. Something he recognized immediately: surprise. They weren't expecting someone like him. Jonathan ignored the stares and continued down the narrow hallway, his calm demeanor a practiced shield against the unspoken questions he could almost hear. Who is he? Why is he here? When he stepped into the courtroom, the room fell momentarily quiet. It was a small, almost claustrophobic space, with wooden benches arranged in uneven rows, and walls lined with faded state flags. A low murmur picked back up, but Jonathan could feel the weight of eyes on him as he chose a seat near the back. At the front, the defendant sat slumped at the defense table. Malcolm Rivers couldn't have been more than 17. His shoulders were hunched, his hands fidgeting in his lap as he glanced nervously between his public defender and the judge's bench. His face was young, but his expression was hardened, wary, as though he already knew the odds were stacked against him. Jonathan studied him for a moment, the boy's quiet presence stirring something deep and familiar within him. Malcolm reminded him of the countless young black men he'd seen come through his own courtroom, bright eyes dulled by circumstance, heavy burdens placed on them before they'd even had a chance to start living. Judge Winters presiding. The bailiff's voice cut through the murmurs, and everyone stood as the judge entered. Jonathan rose with them, his posture straight, his face unreadable. Judge Winters was an older man, with thinning white hair and sharp features, his expression permanently set in a slight frown. He settled into his seat with a heavy sigh, tapping his gavel once before scanning the room. His eyes landed briefly on Jonathan, narrowing slightly in recognition. Winters knew who Jonathan was, or at least he should have. In legal circles, the name Jonathan Hayes carried weight, but here, it seemed Winters wasn't particularly pleased to see him. "Let's get started," Judge Winters grumbled, shuffling through the stack of papers on his desk. The prosecutor, a stocky man with a gruff voice, stood and began reading out the charges. Jonathan listened quietly, his expression stoic. The case was flimsy, as he'd already known, but the rhetoric coming from the prosecutor was enough to make his jaw tighten. "Caught fleeing the scene," the man said, his voice dripping with implication. "The store owner, Mr. Carver, has been clear about what he saw." Jonathan shifted slightly in his seat. It wasn't the words themselves that grated on him. It was the way the prosecutor delivered them, his tone painting Malcolm as a foregone conclusion, rather than a young man entitled to the presumption of innocence. As the hearing continued, Jonathan's frustration grew. The public defender stammered through her questions, unprepared and outmatched. Malcolm sat still, staring down at the table, as though he'd already resigned himself to whatever fate was coming. Jonathan had seen it before. The quiet surrender of someone who understood just how little power they truly had. When Mr. Carver, the shop owner, took the stand, Jonathan leaned forward slightly. Carver was a wiry man in his late 50s, dressed in a stiff suit that didn't quite fit. His voice wavered as he recounted the theft, describing how he'd seen Malcolm in his store, how the boy had looked suspicious and out of place. "He was loitering, just looking around like he was up to something," Carver said, his words landing like quiet daggers. "And then when I turned my back, he grabbed something and bolted." The prosecutor nodded approvingly. "And you're certain it was him?" "Of course I'm certain." Jonathan felt a familiar heat building in his chest, though his expression remained controlled. The words sat heavy in the room. Suspicious. Out of place. Words Jonathan had heard whispered or spoken outright about himself at many points in his life. The hearing wrapped up quickly. Too quickly for Jonathan's liking. Judge Winters barely glanced at the defense before speaking. "This case will proceed to trial," Winters said, his tone curt. "Bail is set at $10,000. Jonathan's hands tightened around his briefcase. He could feel the air leave the room as Malcolm's shoulders slumped further, his face falling. $10,000 was an impossible sum for a boy like Malcolm, and everyone in the room knew it. As the courtroom began to empty, Jonathan rose to his feet, his movements deliberate. He ignored the curious glances as he walked toward the defense table, where Malcolm's public defender was hastily packing up her papers. "Excuse me," Jonathan said softly. The woman looked up, startled. "Can I help you?" Jonathan turned his gaze to Malcolm, who was staring at him with a mix of confusion and guarded curiosity. "Malcolm," Jonathan said gently. "My name is Jonathan Hayes." The boy didn't respond, his eyes narrowing slightly. Jonathan looked back at the lawyer. "Who do I speak to about covering his bail?" The public defender blinked, clearly caught off guard. I beg your pardon? Jonathan's voice was calm, but there was steel beneath it. Bail, who do I speak to? You want to pay his bail? She repeated, her tone tinged with skepticism. Yes. Malcolm looked up sharply, his expression shifting from suspicion to surprise. Jonathan met his gaze and offered a small nod. Reassurance, a bridge of trust being built. The public defender hesitated before clearing her throat. You can speak to the clerk's office down the hall. Thank you. As Jonathan turned to leave, he caught Judge Winters watching him from the bench. Their eyes met briefly, and Winters' frown deepened. Jonathan held his gaze for a moment before walking out of the courtroom, his footsteps echoing loudly. The tension followed him out the door. But Jonathan didn't care. He'd come here for a reason, and that reason was no longer just to observe. He knew what men like Winters, Klein, and Carver saw when they looked at Malcolm, and he also knew that if no one stood up for him, the boy would become another name lost in the cracks of the system. Not today, Jonathan thought. Not this time. Jonathan's shoes echoed against the tiled floor of the courthouse hallway as he walked toward the clerk's office. His posture remained calm, but a storm brewed beneath the surface. Frustration coiled tight in his chest, tempered only by his focus on the task ahead. $10,000. For a boy who likely didn't have 10 to his name, it was nothing short of a prison sentence. When Jonathan stepped into the clerk's office, the man behind the counter, thin, balding, with spectacles perched on the edge of his nose, looked up lazily. His gaze sharpened when he took in Jonathan's presence. Yes? The clerk drawled, setting his pen down. I'd like to cover Malcolm Rivers' bail, Jonathan said, his tone even but firm. The clerk blinked, clearly surprised. You're paying his bail? That's what I said. Are you related to the defendant? No. Jonathan didn't elaborate, and he saw the hesitation flash across the clerk's face. Another silent, why that Jonathan refused to answer. Where do I sign? The clerk sighed and slid a form across the counter. Fill this out. You'll need ID and proof of funds. Jonathan reached for his wallet, but before he could begin signing, the door behind him swung open with a sharp creak. Mr. Hayes! Jonathan turned, recognizing the voice before he saw the face. Deputy Klein stepped into the room, the same smug look from earlier plastered across his features. Two other officers stood behind him, their eyes cold and wary. Jonathan's muscles tensed. Yes? Klein held his gaze for a beat too long, then jerked his thumb toward the door. I need you to come with me. Jonathan didn't move. Why? It's just a few questions, won't take long. Jonathan felt the room shrink around him. Is there a reason you're pulling me out of here right now? Klein's smile didn't reach his eyes. Let's not make this difficult. You're holding up official proceedings. The words dripped with condescension. Jonathan scanned the room, feeling the weight of every gaze, curious, suspicious, accusatory, settling on him. He could already see the story forming in their minds. What's this man really doing here? Calmly, he placed his wallet and pen back in his briefcase. Lead the way. Jonathan followed Klein down the hallway, the two other officers trailing behind like shadows. As they passed through the front lobby, conversations fell silent, heads turning as the procession moved. Jonathan ignored the stares, keeping his back straight and his steps steady. He wouldn't give them the satisfaction of seeing him unsettled. Klein led him into a small, poorly lit room. An interrogation room, Jonathan realized immediately. The walls were bare, except for a dingy clock that ticked loudly above a scratched table. A single metal chair sat across from another, and a fluorescent bulb buzzed overhead. Jonathan exhaled slowly as he took the chair Klein gestured to, setting his briefcase beside him. What's this about? Klein leaned against the table, crossing his arms over his chest. You're awfully involved in a case that doesn't concern you, Mr. Hayes. Jonathan met his gaze coolly. Justice concerns me. That's the nature of my profession. Oh, right, Klein smirked. You're a lawyer, huh? Jonathan didn't correct him. He was used to the assumption that he was just a lawyer, never imagining that someone like him could sit on the state Supreme Court. He let the silence linger, watching Klein fidget under the weight of his gaze. Why are you paying the boy's bail? Klein finally asked. Jonathan folded his hands. Because it's the right thing to do. Doesn't look good, Klein said, his tone sharp now. Some outsider throwing money around for a kid like that, people are gonna ask questions. Jonathan's chest tightened at the veiled suggestion, a kid like that. He felt the words like a slap, though his expression remained unreadable. If the system worked as it should, no one would have to ask questions. Klein straightened, his smile faltering into something colder. Don't get smart with me. You don't know anything about this town, about that boy. Jonathan tilted his head slightly. I know enough to see what's happening here. You think you're better than us? Klein snapped, the mask slipping. You show up in your fancy suit, talking about justice, like you know what's right for us. Jonathan held his gaze, the tension crackling in the air. He could feel the anger vibrating through the deputy's words, anger rooted in something deeper than this single interaction. Control men like Klein didn't like losing it, especially not to men like Jonathan. I don't think I'm better than anyone, Jonathan said quietly. But I do know what's right. Klein slammed his hand on the table, making the metal rattle. Enough of this. We've had reports of a suspicious individual wandering around the courthouse. Jonathan's eyes narrowed. You mean me? That depends, Klein shot back. Are you here stirring up trouble? Jonathan felt a sharp spike of frustration, though he refused to let it show. This is what they want, he reminded himself, to rattle you, to pull you down. I'm here to observe a hearing, Jonathan replied calmly. I've done nothing wrong. Klein leaned in, his face inches from Jonathan's. You sure about that? Before Jonathan could respond, the door creaked open. A figure stepped inside, and Jonathan immediately recognized him. Mitchell, the county clerk, with a nervous expression. He looked between Jonathan and Klein before clearing his throat. Deputy Klein, Mitchell said hesitantly, there's a call for you from Judge Winters. Klein's scowl deepened. Tell him I'll call back. He said it's urgent. Mitchell glanced at Jonathan, then back at Klein. And it's about Mr. Hayes. For a moment, the room was silent. Then Klein straightened, his face red with frustration. Fine, he growled, pushing past Mitchell and storming out the door. Mitchell lingered for a moment, looking at Jonathan with something close to sympathy. Are you all right? Jonathan nodded, though his jaw was tight. I'll be fine. Mitchell hesitated, then added quietly, You're not the first to get pulled into this room, you know. Jonathan's gaze sharpened. No, I imagine I'm not. Mitchell glanced toward the hallway, then back at Jonathan. Just be careful. With that, he left, the door clicking shut behind him. Jonathan sat back in the chair, the anger he'd been holding down threatening to surface. This wasn't new, this quiet, systemic hostility, masquerading as concern or procedure. He had spent his entire life navigating rooms like this one, but it never got easier. Jonathan closed his eyes for a moment, forcing himself to breathe. This wasn't about him. This was about Malcolm. A boy who had been swept into a storm, not of his own making, trapped in a system designed to crush him before he ever had a chance to rise. Jonathan straightened and stood, picking up his briefcase. If they thought intimidation would drive him away, they were mistaken. As he stepped into the hallway, the faint sound of arguing reached his ears. Klein's voice, sharp and defensive, carrying down the hall. Jonathan walked past the front desk, his steps steady as he headed for the courthouse exit. Every head turned to watch him go, but he ignored them. Outside, the sunlight felt harsher than before, its brightness a stark contrast to the weight Jonathan carried in his chest. He paused at the top of the courthouse steps, his jaw tightening as he surveyed the town around him. A storm was coming, one that he wouldn't turn away from. The courthouse doors slammed shut behind Jonathan, the echo sharp and final. The heat of the late morning sun pressed against his skin, but he barely felt it. His mind raced, replaying every word from Deputy Klein and every moment of Malcolm's hearing. It wasn't just bias or oversight. This was deliberate. The stakes were becoming clearer, and Jonathan knew one thing for certain. He couldn't leave this alone. He descended the steps, his steps measured but firm. Across the street, a few people glanced his way, subtle looks that held curiosity or suspicion, as though they weren't sure what to make of the man in the sharp suit walking through their town. Jonathan headed straight for his car, only to hear his name called from behind. "Mr. Hayes!" Jonathan turned to see Mitchell, the county clerk, hurrying across the street toward him. Mitchell's thin frame moved with urgency, his brow slick with sweat despite the breeze. "Mitchell," Jonathan greeted, his voice calm. "What can I do for you?" Mitchell glanced over his shoulder nervously, as if checking to see who might be watching. When he reached Jonathan, his voice dropped to a near whisper. "Listen, I don't have long, but you need to know something. That boy, Malcolm, he never stood a chance." Jonathan frowned. "What do you mean?" Mitchell looked around again before continuing, his words quick and uneven. "I'm saying this whole thing, it's rotten. Carver and Klein. They've been pushing this from the start. You think it's about theft? It's not. Carver's been leaning on Judge Winters for months, and Klein, well, he does what he's told. They want to make an example of Malcolm." Jonathan's chest tightened as the pieces began falling into place. "Why?" "Because it's about control," Mitchell hissed. "You're not from around here, Mr. Hayes, but this town doesn't like people who don't know their place. Especially not a black kid who doesn't know how to bow his head." Jonathan's jaw clenched, but his voice remained level. "Why are you telling me this?" Mitchell hesitated, his eyes darting to the ground. "Because I know what it's like to look the other way, and I'm tired of doing it." He swallowed hard, then added, "Be careful, though, you stepping in like this, they're going to come after you next." Jonathan held his gaze for a moment. "Thank you for telling me." Mitchell nodded quickly and hurried off, disappearing around the corner like a man who'd said more than he should have. Jonathan watched him go, a heavy weight settling in his chest. "They're going to come after you next." Jonathan exhaled sharply, his mind turning. He didn't need the warning. He'd known men like Carver and Klein his entire life. They thrived on unchecked power, convinced that their positions insulated them from accountability, but they were wrong. Jonathan didn't head back to his car. Instead, he walked 2 blocks over to the small, faded brick building that housed the county records office. If Mitchell was right, and Jonathan was increasingly certain that he was, then Carver and Klein had left a trail. They always did. Men like them operated under the assumption that no one would ever look too closely. The office was small, dim, and empty when Jonathan entered. A young woman sat behind the desk, typing lazily on an outdated computer. She glanced up as the bell above the door jingled, and her face immediately shifted into something guarded. "Can I help you?" she asked, her tone clipped. Jonathan offered a polite smile. "I need to take a look at some property records, specifically for a shop owned by Charles Carver." The woman's expression flickered, hesitation mixed with something Jonathan couldn't quite place. "And who are you?" "Jonathan Hayes," he replied, placing his state ID on the counter. "I believe I'm entitled to access public records, am I not?" She hesitated, but finally sighed, pushing her chair back. "I'll get the files," she muttered, disappearing into the back room. Jonathan took the moment to steady himself, running through everything he already knew. If Carver had been leaning on Judge Winters, as Mitchell suggested, there had to be a reason: money, influence, or something far more dangerous. Jonathan had seen it all before. He had faced down corruption in cities far bigger and more complex than this one. But here, in a town small enough for everyone to know everyone else's secrets, the rot was personal. The woman returned a few minutes later with a manila folder, her eyes flicking over Jonathan warily as she set it down on the counter. "These are the records you asked for," she said quickly. "You can look through them here, but don't take anything out of the building." Jonathan nodded his thanks, opened the folder, and began skimming through the papers: deeds, mortgage records, loan agreements. It was all there, buried in plain sight, and then he saw it. A series of unpaid loans taken out by Charles Carver, loans held surprisingly by the county sheriff's office. Jonathan frowned, his pulse quickening as he pieced it together. Carver owed money. Money he couldn't pay back. Klein had likely been pressuring him, leaning on the very system he claimed to uphold. And Malcolm was just the scapegoat, someone for Carver and Klein to point to deflect attention and re-establish their control. Jonathan shut the folder, his mind spinning with the implications. This was corruption at its most blatant, unchecked, unchallenged, and if Jonathan hadn't come here, no one would have questioned it. As he set the file down, the door to the office slammed open. Jonathan turned sharply to see Deputy Klein striding inside, his expression thunderous. "I told you to stay out of this," Klein growled, his voice like gravel. Jonathan remained calm, straightening to his full height. "And I told you I'm here for justice." Klein's face darkened. "You think you're a hero, don't you, coming in here, acting like you own the place?" Jonathan's voice was steady as he replied, "I'm here because someone has to be." "You don't belong here," Klein snapped, stepping closer, his hand resting near his holster. The message wasn't subtle. "This is our town. You don't get to walk in and start making trouble." Jonathan didn't flinch. "I think Malcolm Rivers' family would disagree." Klein's lip curled, his face flushed with anger. "You think you're smarter than me?" Jonathan tilted his head, his gaze unwavering. "I don't need to be smarter than you, I just need the truth." Klein's hand twitched near his holster, and Jonathan's pulse quickened. He didn't doubt for a second that Klein wanted an excuse. One small move, one raised voice, and the deputy would turn this into something far uglier. But Jonathan wasn't going to give him the satisfaction. The tension hung heavy in the air, the silence stretching uncomfortably. And then, "Deputy Klein!" Both men turned to see Mitchell standing in the doorway, his face pale but determined. He held up a piece of paper, his hand shaking slightly. "Judge Winters is asking for you." Klein's glare shifted between Jonathan and Mitchell, the veins in his neck straining. For a moment, Jonathan thought the deputy might ignore the summons entirely. But then, with a low growl, Klein jabbed a finger in Jonathan's direction. "This isn't over." Jonathan didn't say a word as Klein turned and stormed out of the office, his boots thudding heavily against the floor. Mitchell let out a shaky breath. "You okay?" Jonathan nodded slowly, his pulse beginning to settle. "I'm fine." Mitchell hesitated, then stepped closer. "I've got a copy of everything in that file. If you need proof, I'll back you up." Jonathan looked at him, a spark of gratitude breaking through the tension. "Thank you, Mitchell. You just made yourself part of this." "I already was," Mitchell said quietly. Jonathan picked up his briefcase and walked to the door, his mind clear now. The stakes were higher than ever. Malcolm's life, the truth, and justice itself were all hanging in the balance. But Jonathan had faced bigger battles before, and he wasn't leaving this town. Until he won. The courtroom buzzed with murmured conversations as the clock ticked toward noon. Jonathan Hayes stood quietly at the back, his sharp gaze surveying the room. Malcolm Rivers sat at the defense table, his small frame swallowed by an oversized gray suit. He glanced nervously toward the gallery. His mother gripping the edge of her seat, her expression weary with fear and exhaustion. At the front of the room, Judge Winters shuffled papers, his expression pinched as though the hearing itself was a nuisance. Beside him, Deputy Klein lingered by the wall, his uniform crisp and his demeanor smug. Every so often, Klein's eyes flicked to Jonathan, his lip curling ever so slightly. A silent challenge. Jonathan didn't return the look. He was focused on the task ahead. Today Jonathan wasn't here to observe. Today, he was here to act. The bailiff stepped forward and cleared his throat. "Court is now in session. Judge Winters presiding." Everyone rose as the judge entered, then sat back down. Jonathan remained standing, stepping forward calmly. "Your Honor," he said, his voice carrying across the room like a quiet storm. Judge Winters looked up, startled. "Mr. Hayes?" "I'd like to address the court." The room fell still, the murmurs stopping abruptly. Winters narrowed his eyes. "This isn't your case, Mr. Hayes. You have no standing here." "Perhaps not formally," Jonathan replied. "But I have standing as a citizen, as someone who cares deeply about justice." "You're out of line," Winters snapped, his gavel poised. "Out of line?" Jonathan repeated, his voice calm but edged with steel. He turned, sweeping the room with a piercing gaze. "What's out of line is what's happening in this courtroom right now. A young boy is being railroaded by a system that has already decided his guilt, and I won't stand by and watch." "Sit down, Mr. Hayes," Judge Winters barked, his face flushing red. "This is highly inappropriate." "Inappropriate?" Jonathan's voice cut through him like a blade. "No, Your Honor. What's inappropriate is Deputy Klein's conduct. What's inappropriate is Mr. Carver's coercion." What's inappropriate is a judge presiding over a case while turning a blind eye to corruption. The courtroom erupted into chaos, whispers, gasps, the clatter of chairs as people turned to see the confrontation unfolding. Judge Winters pounded his gavel furiously. "Order!" Winters shouted, his voice shaking. "Mr. Hayes, I'll hold you in contempt." Jonathan didn't flinch. "Then hold me in contempt, but you will not silence me." Deputy Klein stepped forward now, his voice sharp and mocking. "You don't know what you're talking about, Hayes. You're making a fool of yourself." Jonathan turned to face him fully. "Oh, I know exactly what I'm talking about, Deputy. I have evidence." Klein froze, his expression flickering. Surprise, then fear, though he quickly masked it. "What evidence?" Jonathan reached into his briefcase and withdrew a stack of papers. "Property records, loan agreements, a clear financial link between Mr. Carver and the county sheriff's office." He walked forward, his voice rising as he handed the documents to the clerk. "Carver's debts have been hanging over his head for years, and who's been leaning on him? The same man who arrested Malcolm Rivers, Deputy Stephen Klein." The air in the room felt charged, like the build-up to a storm. Klein's face darkened, his hand inching toward his belt as if to regain control. "You don't know what you're talking about," Klein growled. "Oh, but I do," Jonathan shot back, his voice ringing with authority. "This entire case is built on lies, a lie that started with Carver's desperation and continued with your abuse of power. Malcolm Rivers is here because of you." Klein took a step forward, his face flushed with anger. "Watch yourself, Hayes." "Or what?" Jonathan said, standing tall. "You'll arrest me too. Maybe you'll try to intimidate me into silence like you've done to others in this town. It won't work." Klein's hand dropped to his holster, his knuckles whitening. The room gasped audibly. Jonathan didn't move, though his heart raced in his chest. He could see the crack in Klein's composure, the moment when the man's arrogance turned to desperation. "Deputy!" Judge Winters barked, his voice sharp. "Stand down!" But Klein wasn't listening, his face contorted with anger as he took another step toward Jonathan. "You don't belong here," he spat, his voice trembling. "People like you think you can come into our town, into our lives, and tell us how to live. You're nothing." Jonathan's eyes narrowed, his voice calm but dangerous. "And what, exactly do you mean by people like me?" The room went deathly quiet. Klein froze, realizing too late the weight of his words. Jonathan stared at him, unblinking, holding him there in that silence. "I think you've made yourself clear, Deputy," Jonathan said softly, his voice cutting like glass. He turned back to the judge, his tone rising again. "Your Honor, I have provided evidence of corruption and abuse of power. At the very least, this hearing must be dismissed. Malcolm Rivers deserves freedom, and this court owes him justice." Judge Winters' face was pale now, his jaw set as he looked down at the papers Jonathan had provided. The weight of the room hung on his shoulders. Jonathan pressed on, his voice steady. "Malcolm Rivers is innocent, and I will not let you or anyone else turn this boy into another casualty of a broken system." The silence stretched. All eyes turned to Winters, waiting. For the first time, the judge looked unsettled, shifting in his seat as though the room were suddenly too small. He glanced at the papers, then at Klein, whose face was still twisted with rage. "This is highly irregular," Winters said finally, though his voice lacked conviction. Jonathan stepped forward one last time. "The truth is often irregular, Your Honor. But it's still the truth." Winters hesitated for a long moment, then nodded sharply. "This hearing is adjourned. The charges against Malcolm Rivers are dismissed, pending further investigation." The word sent a wave of relief crashing through the room. Malcolm's mother let out a muffled sob, her hand flying to her mouth. Malcolm stared at Jonathan, wide-eyed, as though he couldn't believe what he was hearing. Deputy Klein, meanwhile, turned on Winters. "Judge, enough," Winters barked. "Step back, Deputy. This is over." Klein's face turned a deep red, his fists clenching at his sides, but Jonathan wasn't watching him anymore. Instead, he turned to Malcolm, who was still frozen in his chair. Jonathan offered the boy a small, reassuring nod. "You're free now, Malcolm." Malcolm looked up at him, tears welling in his eyes. "Thank you," he whispered. Jonathan placed a firm hand on the boy's shoulder. Don't thank me, just live your life, that's the real victory. As Jonathan turned to leave, he caught sight of Klein one last time. The deputy stood rigid, his eyes burning with unspoken hatred. Jonathan knew this wasn't the end. Not for men like Klein. But it didn't matter. Jonathan had done what he came to do. As he stepped outside into the sunlight, the town felt different. Quieter, as though something heavy had finally lifted. He took a deep breath, feeling the weight of his actions settle on his shoulders. It wasn't over. It never really was. But for today, justice had won. And that was enough. Jonathan stood at the center of the small, cramped sheriff's office, a steady storm brewing behind his calm exterior. The stale air reeked of sweat, old coffee, and something far worse, authority left unchecked for too long. Deputy Stephen Klein stood across the room, his shoulders squared, arms crossed like a man daring anyone to challenge him. Behind him, the sheriff, a broad, gray-haired man with a face like weathered leather, sat slouched in his chair, his tired eyes darting between Jonathan and Klein. "Mr. Hayes," the sheriff drawled, though his voice held little welcome. "You've stirred up quite the fuss today." Jonathan adjusted his cufflinks, his voice low but steady. "What I've done, Sheriff, is expose the truth, a truth that's been festering in this town for far too long." Klein scoffed. "What truth that you don't know how things work around here?" Jonathan turned his gaze to him, his stare sharp as glass. "No, deputy. The truth that you and Charles Carver conspired to use a child as a pawn in your dirty game. The truth that this so-called justice system is a rigged machine, with you and your friends pulling the levers." Klein's face darkened, his hand twitching at his belt where his holster sat. "Watch your mouth, Hayes." "Or what?" Jonathan challenged, stepping closer, his posture tall and unwavering. "You'll arrest me, assault me, call it resisting. Is that how you silence people who don't bend to your authority?" "Careful," the sheriff said quickly, his voice edged with warning. "Let's keep this civil." But it was too late. The mask had already slipped. Klein's face was red with anger, his lip curled. "You don't know a damn thing about this town, or about me," he snarled. "You think you can just walk in here, flash your fancy suit and play savior?" Jonathan held his ground, his voice cool and cutting. "I'm not playing anything, deputy. I'm ensuring a boy doesn't pay for the sins of men like you." The sheriff stood now, raising a hand to calm the tension. "That's enough. Let's take a breath before this goes any further." Jonathan turned his attention to the sheriff. "This has already gone far enough. I have property records, financial records, and witness statements. I have proof that your deputy and Charles Carver orchestrated this entire farce to cover Carver's debts and protect their own reputations." The sheriff's face paled slightly, his voice more clipped now. "You don't have the full picture, Mr. Hayes. Small towns have complicated relationships." "That's not a relationship. That's corruption," Jonathan replied, his voice rising for the first time. "This isn't about Carver's debts, and it's not about Malcolm Rivers. It's about control. It's about men like Deputy Klein using their positions to destroy lives because they think no one will stop them." Klein laughed bitterly, shaking his head. "You don't get it, do you? People like Malcolm? They don't matter. They're born trouble, born to lose. This whole thing is just a reminder, so the rest of them know their place." The words hit the room like a slap, sucking the air from it. Even the sheriff looked momentarily stunned by the blunt cruelty of Klein's admission. Jonathan's heart hammered in his chest, his blood roaring in his ears, but he refused to let his fury show. Instead, he took a single, deliberate step forward. "You're wrong," Jonathan said, his voice low and steady, every word laced with a quiet force. "You think you're protecting this town, you're tearing it apart. Men like you have built your power on fear, on lies, and on the backs of people who never had a fair chance, but I promise you, that ends today." Klein's eyes narrowed dangerously, his hand fully resting on his holster now. "Is that so?" Jonathan didn't flinch. "It is." He turned back to the sheriff. "If you want to save what little dignity your office has left, you'll act. Now you'll investigate Klein and Carver, you'll drop all charges against Malcolm Rivers, and ensure this never happens again." The sheriff hesitated, sweat beading on his brow. That's not how it works, Mr. Hayes." "Then make it work," Jonathan said sharply. Because if you don't, this evidence will go to the state. I'll take this to the media, to the governor, to every judge in this state, and I'll make sure this town's dirty laundry is aired for the world to see. Klein's voice turned into a growl. You're threatening us? No, Jonathan replied, his voice cutting through the tension like a blade. I'm holding you accountable. The room fell silent. The sheriff stared at Jonathan, his face lined with the weight of a decision that could unravel his entire department. Klein's jaw ticked, his hand twitching with the urge to act. For a long moment, no one moved, and then, the sheriff sank back into his chair, his voice hollow. What do you want? Jonathan's shoulders relaxed just slightly, though his gaze never wavered. I want justice. Drop the charges against Malcolm Rivers, issue a public statement clearing his name, and suspend Deputy Klein pending an investigation. Klein spun on the sheriff. You can't be serious, you're going to listen to him. The sheriff's face was pale now, his voice heavy. You've left me no choice, Stephen. You coward! Klein spat, his face twisted with fury. His hand yanked the gun halfway from his holster, and Jonathan instinctively stepped back. Stand down, Klein, the sheriff barked, his voice shaking with authority. For a moment, Jonathan thought Klein might ignore him. The deputy's eyes blazed with unfiltered rage, his knuckles white against the weapon. Then, slowly, he pushed the gun back into its holster and stepped away, his chest heaving. You'll regret this, Klein snarled, pointing a shaking finger at Jonathan. You don't know what you've done. Jonathan stared at him, unblinking. I know exactly what I've done. Outside, the late afternoon sun hung low, streaking the sky with gold and crimson. Jonathan stood at the top of the sheriff's office steps, his breath steadying as the door shut behind him. Malcolm Rivers and his mother were waiting near the sidewalk, their faces uncertain, like they dared not believe what they'd heard. Jonathan approached them, his expression softening as he met Malcolm's wide-eyed gaze. It's over, he said gently. The charges are dropped. You're free. Malcolm blinked, his lips parting slightly as though he didn't trust the words. It's over? Jonathan nodded. It's over. Malcolm's mother let out a choked sob, covering her face with her hands. As her shoulders shook, Jonathan placed a steady hand on Malcolm's shoulder. This isn't the end for you, he said quietly. You have a chance now. Take it. Malcolm nodded slowly, tears glistening in his eyes as he whispered, Thank you. Jonathan gave his shoulder a reassuring squeeze before stepping back. He turned toward his car, his muscles aching with the weight of the day. As he slid into the driver's seat, he glanced at the sheriff's office one last time. He could see Klein's silhouette in the window, watching him with unmasked hatred. Jonathan knew this wasn't the end. Men like Klein didn't disappear quietly. The fight would continue in one form or another. But for now, he had won. Jonathan exhaled, gripping the steering wheel tightly as he stared out at the horizon. The town lay behind him, but the road ahead stretched wide, uncertain, and full of possibility. For Malcolm Rivers, for this town, for justice, Jonathan Hayes had drawn a line in the sand, and he wasn't afraid of what came next. The next morning, the sun rose slowly over the small town, bathing the cracked pavement and worn brick buildings in soft golden light. It was the kind of morning that felt quiet, untouched, though Jonathan knew better. Beneath the surface, things were shifting. Jonathan stood near the courthouse steps, his hands tucked into the pockets of his coat as the town buzzed with cautious whispers. A small crowd had gathered. Townsfolk, a few reporters who had caught wind of the events, and Malcolm Rivers' family, standing quietly near the back. Even from where he stood, Jonathan could see the uncertainty in their faces. Could they trust this sudden justice? Could they believe that someone had finally stood up and won? The courthouse doors creaked open, and out stepped Sheriff Adams, his shoulders heavy and his eyes darting nervously over the crowd. Behind him came a small, somber-looking procession. A pair of deputies flanking Stephen Klein, his face pale and tight, his hands cuffed behind his back. The crowd rippled with gasps and murmurs. Klein's eyes darted to Jonathan as he was led down the steps. There was no anger now, only a simmering bitterness. A man realizing that his unchecked reign had finally come to an end. As the deputies led him toward a waiting squad car, Jonathan took a step forward, placing himself in Klein's line of sight. He said nothing. He didn't need to. The message was clear. This is accountability. Klein paused at the car door, his voice low and venomous. You think this changes anything, Hayes? Jonathan met his glare evenly, his voice calm but firm. It changes everything for you, for this town, and for people like Malcolm. Klein smirked faintly, though the cracks in his composure were obvious. This town will forget, they always do. Jonathan shook his head. Not this time. Klein was shoved into the back of the car, the door slamming shut with finality. Jonathan watched as the vehicle pulled away, its wheels kicking up small clouds of dust. The air felt lighter now, as though the town itself had exhaled a breath it didn't know it was holding. Inside the courthouse, Sheriff Adams approached Jonathan, his hat gripped tightly in his hands. He looked smaller now, worn down by the weight of his own complicity. I didn't know, the sheriff muttered, his voice hoarse. Jonathan tilted his head slightly, his eyes narrowing. Didn't know, or didn't want to? The sheriff flinched, his gaze falling to the floor. I should have acted sooner, but it's hard to stand against your own. Jonathan nodded slowly, his voice soft, but unrelenting. It's harder to live with the cost of silence. Adams sighed, wiping his brow with the back of his hand. I'll make sure there's a full investigation. Klein's not the only one who's been dirty around here, I can promise you that. I'll hold you to it, Jonathan said, simply. He turned to leave, but paused, looking back at the sheriff. Start by being honest with this town, they deserve the truth. Adams swallowed hard and nodded. You're right, it's time they heard it. By afternoon, word had spread far beyond the town's borders. News crews arrived, cameras rolling, as reporters tried to untangle the story of corruption and justice that had unfolded in a place no one had paid attention to before. Jonathan watched the frenzy quietly from the sidelines. He wasn't here for the cameras or the headlines, he was here for Malcolm Rivers and the countless others like him, those who had been left behind, overlooked, or crushed under the weight of a broken system. Near the edge of the crowd, Jonathan spotted Malcolm standing with his mother. The boy still looked small, dwarfed by the chaos around him, but there was something different in his posture now. Something stronger. When their eyes met, Malcolm hesitated, then approached slowly. Jonathan smiled faintly. How are you holding up? Malcolm shrugged, his voice soft. I don't know. It's like it's over, but it's not. Does that make sense? It does, Jonathan said quietly. What happened to you? It doesn't just go away. But this is a beginning, Malcolm. You're free now. You have a chance to write the next chapter. Malcolm looked up at him, his eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and something deeper. Hope. Do you think it'll change? He asked. The way they look at me? The way they look at us? Jonathan's chest tightened, but his voice remained steady. Change takes time, and it doesn't come easy, but every stand we take gets us closer. Malcolm nodded slowly, as if considering the weight of Jonathan's words. What do I do now? Jonathan placed a hand on the boy's shoulder. You live, Malcolm. You learn. You dream bigger than they'll ever let themselves believe you can, and when you get the chance, you fight for someone else, someone who needs it as much as you did. Malcolm blinked, his throat bobbing as he swallowed back tears. Thank you, Mr. Hayes. Jonathan smiled softly. You don't owe me thanks. You just owe it to yourself to keep going. Malcolm's mother stepped forward then, her voice trembling. I don't know how we can ever repay you. You don't have to, Jonathan replied gently. But if you ever feel like you can't keep fighting, remember this day. Remember that you're not alone. As the sun dipped lower in the sky, the crowd began to disperse. Jonathan leaned against his car, watching as families returned to their homes and news crews packed up their equipment. The echoes of what had happened here would linger, even after the cameras were gone. Mitchell approached, looking sheepish but determined. You did it, he said, a faint smile breaking through. We did it, Jonathan corrected. You spoke up when no one else would. Mitchell nodded, rubbing the back of his neck. I guess I just got tired of pretending it wasn't happening, tired of being afraid. Jonathan's gaze softened. That's how change begins. Mitchell hesitated, then said, Are you staying in town, or heading back to the city? Jonathan glanced toward the horizon, where the road stretched far and wide, leading him away from this place. "I've done what I needed to here." Mitchell looked disappointed, but nodded in understanding. "If you ever come back, you'll be welcome. People won't forget what you did." Jonathan smiled faintly. "Let's hope they remember why it mattered." As Jonathan drove down the two-lane road leading out of town, he felt the weight of everything that had happened settle into something quieter. The fight wasn't over. It never was. Klein was gone, but others would rise to take his place. The system that allowed corruption and injustice to thrive was bigger than any single town, any single courtroom. But for today, justice had prevailed. Jonathan rolled down the window, letting the cool evening air wash over him. He thought of Malcolm, his face as he walked free from the courthouse, the spark of hope that hadn't been there before. That spark was enough to keep Jonathan going. Change didn't happen all at once. It happened in moments, in choices, in the small stands people took every day. It happened when someone like Malcolm Rivers got a second chance. It happened when people like Mitchell decided to speak up. And it happened when men like Jonathan Hayes refused to stay silent. As the sun dipped below the horizon, Jonathan's phone buzzed on the seat beside him. He glanced at it, his lips curving into a faint smile, when he saw the message. "Mr. Hayes, I know a kid in my district who's in trouble could use someone like you to help." Jonathan's fingers tightened on the wheel as the road stretched ahead. There would always be another fight. Another name. Another town. And Jonathan Hayes would be ready. The hum of the highway was the only sound in Jonathan Hayes' car as he drove. The world around him fading into a blur of trees, fields, and small towns that felt both familiar and distant. The afternoon sun cast long shadows over the pavement, its golden glow a stark contrast to the weight he carried in his chest. Jonathan had been here before. On the road, moving from one case, one town, one battle to the next. It wasn't the work of a single man, and he knew that. But the knowledge never stopped him from showing up, even when the fight felt endless. His phone rested on the passenger seat, the screen dark for now, though he knew it wouldn't stay that way for long. It never did. The message he had received earlier, another call for help, served as a reminder that the work was far from over. But something was different this time. The events of the last few days, the confrontation with Deputy Klein, and the unraveling of corruption in that small forgotten town, had shifted something in him. The faces of the people he'd met lingered in his mind. Malcolm Rivers, standing wide-eyed in a courtroom where he'd been saved from becoming just another statistic. Mitchell, who had finally found the courage to speak out against a broken system. And even the quiet crowd that had watched as justice, for once, prevailed. Jonathan's reflection stared back at him in the rearview mirror, calm, composed, yet carrying the weight of 1,000 unspoken stories. He knew the world hadn't changed overnight. For every Malcolm who walked free, there were countless others still caught in the gears of a system that saw them as expendable. But change was made in moments. This was something Jonathan had come to understand through years of fighting battles just like this one. Small victories added up. Hope sparked in dark places where it had no right to exist. The ripples of justice, no matter how faint, spread further than anyone could see. That night, Jonathan checked into a small roadside motel, the neon sign buzzing faintly as he unlocked the door to his room. It wasn't much, just a bed, a desk, and a window overlooking an empty parking lot. But it was quiet. He placed his briefcase on the desk and sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clasped loosely in his lap. For the first time in hours, he allowed himself to pause to breathe. Jonathan thought about Malcolm, about the moment the charges had been dropped and the boy had walked free. The look on his face, equal parts disbelief and relief, would stay with Jonathan for a long time. It was a reminder of why he did this work. He had once been Malcolm. Maybe not in the same exact way, but close enough. A young black man facing a world that expected him to fail, that tried to dictate his worth, before he ever had a chance to define it for himself. Jonathan had been lucky. His adoptive parents had given him the foundation he needed to rise, to fight, to break through every barrier the world placed in his path. But luck shouldn't determine whether someone got to live a full and meaningful life. Jonathan knew that all too well. Do you think it'll change? Malcolm's question echoed in his mind, and Jonathan let out a slow breath, staring at the ceiling. Yes, he thought. But not without a fight. Jonathan opened his briefcase and pulled out a worn notebook, its pages filled with notes, names, and the fragments of cases he'd worked on over the years. He flipped to an empty page and wrote, "Change begins with accountability. It begins when we refuse to stay silent." He stared at the words for a long moment before setting the pen down. In the days following Klein's arrest and Carver's exposure, news of the events rippled through the state. The story made its way into newspapers, television reports, and online forums. Some called it justice. Others called it chaos. People debated, argued, and dissected every detail. But no one ignored it. The town itself became a symbol of a deeper issue, of a justice system plagued by abuse of power, of the consequences of silence, and of the courage it took to confront the truth. People began to ask questions, to challenge long-standing assumptions. Allies emerged where there had been none before, local leaders promised reforms, while state investigators descended on the town to dig deeper into the rot Jonathan had uncovered. It wasn't perfect. It was messy, slow, and imperfect, as all change tended to be. Jonathan watched it unfold from afar, his role complete for now. He didn't need to be in the spotlight. He didn't need credit or applause. He only needed to know that his stand had mattered, that the ripples he'd created would continue to spread. Weeks later, Jonathan received a letter in the mail, the handwriting careful and deliberate. He opened it to find a note from Malcolm Rivers. "Dear Mr. Hayes, I wanted to thank you again for everything you did for me. My mom says you saved my life, but I think you gave me something even bigger. You gave me hope. I started school again this week, and I'm working hard because I don't want to waste the chance you gave me. I hope I can be like you one day, fighting for people who need help. Sincerely, Malcolm." Jonathan's throat tightened as he read the words. For a moment, he simply sat there, the letter resting gently in his hands. He placed it in the drawer of his desk, alongside dozens of other letters and notes he'd collected over the years. Reminders of why the fight mattered. Jonathan Hayes had changed over the years. He had seen victories, failures, and the ugliest sides of humanity. But through it all, his resolve had only strengthened. The fight wasn't about winning every battle. It was about showing up, again and again, until the world began to shift, no matter how slowly. In every case, in every town, he saw himself. He saw young men like Malcolm, whose lives hung in the balance. He saw families worn down by hopelessness, and he saw systems that refused to change unless they were forced to. Jonathan couldn't fix everything, he knew that. But he could fix something. And that was enough to keep him going. The road stretched ahead, endless and uncertain, as Jonathan's car hummed softly beneath him. Somewhere out there, another case waited, another name, another injustice, another stand that needed to be taken. Jonathan didn't know where the road would lead him next, but as he drove, his thoughts were clear. One fight at a time, one victory at a time, until the ripples become a wave. In his rear-view mirror, the sun dipped below the horizon, casting the world in twilight. Ahead, the road carried him forward, a quiet promise of what was still to come. And Jonathan Hayes would be there, ready, resilient, and unafraid.